The i3 2120, now nearing its 10th birthday, was considered quite a great budget option a decade ago, as at that time CPUs with 2 cores were quite popular and could still provide great results in all the newest games, especially if they were dual cores with hyper-threading, a nice bonus which proved to be a great option for the future, giving such kind of a CPU a longer lifespan. But how long is that lifespan? Has it finally reached an end in 2021? Or could you still get away with a budget build featuring such a CPU? Well, that's the question that we could possibly answer today, as I made a small budget combination consisting of the i3 2120 and an RX 550, an entry-level GPU from 2017. Never really intended for serious gaming, but could it be just perfect of a pairing with a second-gen i3 for some casual gaming? Well, let's find out with some gaming benchmarks. So first up is a somewhat older but still very demanding title, and a perfect test to begin with. So here was The Witcher 3 running at 1080p with the settings turned all the way down. But regardless of that, it doesn't really affect the game's beautiful visuals, and runs with a pretty stable average FPS of 34. With a few dips while entering big crowded areas, but overall nothing to worry too much about. The very recent release of Hitman 3 runs just above the 30 FPS threshold at 720p with the absolute minimum settings selected. The general experience could be described as a pretty fine one, without any stutters to speak of. It's just that the game goes to 20 to 25 FPS more often than not, which mostly happens in bigger areas on the outside. But as most of the game is played indoors and as it's more of a slow-paced game, it's generally pretty acceptable. Moving on to a faster paced game, here we have Dirt Rally 2 running at 1080p with the medium preset, with the visual quality being quite decent and with some pretty decent average frame rates of 42 FPS. Maybe 60 FPS could be achieved by using the minimum preset, but in my opinion that makes the game's graphics appear to be at least 5 years older. So these settings would be the most balanced ones, considering both the visuals as well as the performance. Shadow of the Tomb Raider always represents a great benchmark for any system, and this one is no exception. So with a 1080p resolution and low settings, the frame rate mostly stays around 30 FPS, but tends to go down to the 20s in very populated areas. So you could change the settings to the absolute minimum and make the game pretty ugly in my opinion, or you could try running it at 720p for example with the medium settings. That would improve the overall stability of the frame rate, improving the visual quality, but sacrificing some of the sharpness of the 1080p resolution. Doom Eternal is kind of a strange story, running at 1680 by 1050 with dynamic resolution scaling enabled. Admittedly not such a popular resolution, but it got really the best results. Although the footage doesn't really appear like that, the general gameplay experience felt pretty good while not recording, as the pretty decent FPS figures can tell that. Far Cry New Dawn runs fine on average with 47 FPS, with the 900p resolution and minimum settings preset, but as usual the game has some heavy dips while turning around or shooting, caused by the CPU usage spikes. So it does hinder the experience in some way, but is not really considerable as a deal breaker in my opinion. And to finish off today's benchmark list, we have a not so demanding but very popular strategy game, tested using the built-in benchmark tool, providing some pretty stable 44 FPS on average. So you could maybe push the settings a bit higher, but even if you don't, the game looks and runs pretty well. There isn't all that much left to say, other than that this combo could bring you a great experience for a very small budget, as long as you don't want to play the newest games like Assassin's Creed Valhalla or the very demanding Horizon Zero Dawn, for example, as the CPU gets overloaded pretty quickly. But for a casual gamer who doesn't mind turning down the settings or resolution, this combo could provide a pretty good experience, especially if you are only into esports gaming, as I didn't test those types of games, but they will run absolutely fine. So to finish this video off with a summary, the i3-2120 and RX 550 aren't such a bad pairing, and for the combined used price of around $60, there isn't much to complain about. And if you find the CPU become pretty weak for the tasks you want to do, you can upgrade it all the way up to a 3rd gen i7. So you will have some room for improvement, not only on the CPU side of things, but the GPU could be replaced as well, but once the prices for those get down to normal.